Welcome to the MVP, the Mass Violence Podcast, the official podcast of the National Mass Violence Center. I'm Dan Smith, Director of Technology and Resources, and on today's episode, we bring you the second installment of our collaboration with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or IACP. Dr. Michael Goodier from IACP has an illuminating conversation with my NMVC colleague, Associate Academic Program Director Elizabeth Cronin, and NMVC consultant Chief Greg Mullen. This conversation is geared toward how important it is for law enforcement to include victim services as part of the planning for mass violence response. But I think that even if you're not a police officer, you'll still find the discussion informative and educational about the process of responding to mass violence. Just as a heads up, we'll be resuming our regular schedule of MVP content starting next month.
Hello, and welcome to another episode in our special podcast series brought to you by the International Association of Chiefs of Police in collaboration with the National Mass Violence Center. I'm Michael Goodier, Program Manager at IACP, and I'll be your host for this series. In today's conversation, we're going to be exploring the critical role that victim services play in the long-term recovery process following mass violence events, why their early involvement is essential, how collaboration between law enforcement and victim advocates works in these complex situations, and what lessons have emerged from real-world experience. I'm honored to be joined today by two exceptional leaders whose work has made a lasting impact in public safety, community resilience, and supporting those affected by tragedy. First, Elizabeth Cronin, Associate Academic Program Director at the National Mass Violence Center, joins us today. And Elizabeth is an accomplished attorney and advocate. She led the New York State Office of Victim Services for more than a decade, served as Director of Legal Affairs at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and was a Deputy Bureau Chief in the Westchester County, New York District Attorney's Office, handling some of the most serious cases, including homicide, sexual assault, and child abuse. Also with us is Chief Greg Mullen, who was Chief of Police in Charleston, South Carolina during the 2015 Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church shooting, and led his department through a period of profound recovery and community healing. More recently, Chief Mullen served as Associate Vice President for Public Safety and Chief of Police at Clemson University, and earlier in his career at the Virginia Beach Police Department, where he rose to the rank of Deputy Chief. Today, he continues to consult in this field, helping bridge law enforcement and victim services in recovery efforts. Elizabeth, Chief Mullen, it's a privilege to have you both here, and I'm sure, as I kind of mentioned before, that I may have left something out there. So before we dive in, is there anything you'd like to add by way of introduction?
Nope, I'm happy to be here.
Same here, it's a pleasure.
Perfect. Then let's dive right in. I think one of the first things I'd like to get your perspectives on is just what does long-term recovery look like from the perspective of victim services after a mass violence event, and how does that really differ from immediate crisis response?
Well, I know from my perspective, I've had a varied career in victim services. So as a prosecutor, I handled cases that was usually crimes against individuals. And then through my time at the Office of Victim Services, where we actually had the opportunity to respond to mass violence, and now at the Mass Violence Center, I think that what research has shown is that victims and survivors go through kind of a whole panoply of emotions. And when you are faced with a crisis of this magnitude, you have kind of that initial response that then becomes what we call the honeymoon phase, where people are grateful for the response by, law enforcement and victim services. The community comes together and everybody feels supported. I saw this happen, for example, with like 9/11. Everybody comes together and then the reality sets in, and nobody recovers the same way, and recovery and healing is not linear. And so we have to be prepared, and that's why it's so important for us to work with people like Chief Mullen and with your organization so that we are doing the work that needs to be done in order to make sure that this community has long-term healing.
I think really from my perspective, the initial The initial phase and response for victim services is really all about creating a safe and stabilizing environment. I mean, that's really what you're trying to do with that family resource center originally when it opens up, and trying to make sure people feel safe, make sure that they have good, accurate information as much as possible, that you provide them with immediate resources around both mental and behavioral health in terms of just that psychological first aid that they really need, helping them get back to some level of being able to make decisions, being able to understand that there are lots of resources available to them, and really trying to figure out what their needs are at that particular time. And I think that immediate response the real impact, you've got chaplains, victim advocates, you've got mental health providers, and all of those people working in collaboration really helps you to create that stabilization and that comfort and safety that has just been ripped away from people, not only those that are directly involved, but also in the community, depending upon the scope and the magnitude of the incident. And where long-term recovery comes in, it's really about promoting the healing and creating some post-traumatic growth that comes from that. And it really is ongoing. I mean, it can happen from months to years. I mean, some situations and incidents that we have dealt with across the country, those individuals are still getting mental health counseling and therapy years after the event. And it also really involves a lot more than what you would traditionally think of as a mental health response. It also, you're looking at finance, donations, legal processes, trials, community rebuilding, all of those things that really are important in terms of your long-term recovery. So while that initial response is about safety and stability, long-term is more about healing and growing and providing that long-term support over extended periods of time, which creates a need for a significant infrastructure.
And I'm so pleased that Chief Mullen raised that, because I think that's what we have all seen at these incidents, is where people who want to help go in assuming immediately that folks are going to be needing mental health and behavioral health resources. And, if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of need, right, that's not what people need. And when my former agency responded to the Buffalo Top shooting, it became very clear that people needed very, very basic things. In addition to having to feel safe so that they could even come out of their homes, they needed things that the Top supermarket would normally have provided: food and, bus passes, the ability to pay your bills. And we found that if those needs weren't being met immediately, that they were not interested in any of the other services, that were assumed to be necessary at that point in time. That, we have to respond to people where they are and when they're there, in order to gain their trust, and also to make sure that when those other needs arise, that they will be in a position to say, yes, now we're willing to take that help.
The distinction you both just made is really important, I think, and often misunderstood, right? About wanting to get to that outcome that we'd like to see for people in terms of healing at the end, but having to start with these, I guess we can call them baby steps. We think of the response as the whole story, but it's kind of these stages, right? And so thinking about that, what happens when victim services are not including in these early phases of a planning process for how an agency would respond in the case of mass violence? Are there real world examples that kind of show where that gap has consequences?
I think that one of the biggest things that happens when they're not included is that you expand the level of chaos and confusion in the middle of the incident, which is the last thing that you want to do. I mean, you want to try to do things that minimize the uncertainty, the anxiety, and the stress that's already there. So the lack of planning and the lack of having victim services engage at the very early part of your planning process or your preparation has downstream impacts during the incident that is really hard to quantify. Some of the real world examples I think that we've seen in different events across the country is when you get into the incident and you have not pre-planned or you have not created at least an awareness of the resources that are available to you through victim services. You can become overwhelmed if you haven't established a process that helps you to deal with that, whether that be an FRC or a family assistance center later on. If you have not put those things in practice, we've seen what happens in different incidents. We've also seen the fact that delays in activation of the FRC or the family assistance center really impacts the level of support and immediate stabilization for victims. And that really also kind of leads into a duplication of effort. If you don't have a coordinated response that's already planned out, you're not going to be as efficient. And when you start having duplicate contacts with individuals that are victims or survivors, that's allows them to lose trust and confidence in what you're actually doing. So you want to make sure that those things are put in place at the very beginning. And I think one of the biggest things that happens in these incident responses that we don't recognize or realize is that if we have not pre-planned and vetted the mental health providers that we're going to bring into these scenarios, they can actually do more damage than they do offer help. So all of these things have been very much identified in after action reviews and other types of scenarios from different agencies in terms of their incident responses. So yes, I think there's some real practical applications and experiences we can learn from others. And the biggest thing, all of this has to do, if we're not pre-planning or pulling all of these things together ahead of time, we don't have the opportunity to create the trust and connection, which is really the foundation of all of the response processes that we need in these types of incidents.
And this is such a good question because I have found going out to communities around the country and talking with them about planning for mass violence, how many of these communities do not have a connection or a relationship with victim services or the behavioral mental health field, so that if something happens, you don't want to be scrambling for services, because that just delays help for people. And one incident that I saw directly was we responded to a mass violence event in New York City, and my former agency funded a victim assistance program in a particular hospital, and victims were being brought to that hospital. So when we contacted the program, the hospital had never contacted the victim program that was in their own hospital to connect the people who were being brought in after that incident with victim services, so there was a real disconnect there. And so you could see how that would play out more broadly. And the other thing is that we want people to respond to these events who understand the dynamics of what they're walking into and that they have the training. And Chief Mullen had mentioned earlier about psychological first aid or PFA training. We want to know who has that training and, who are we letting in to the Family Assistance Center or the Friends and Relatives Center to work with people who are at, the lowest point and make sure that, as he said, we're not doing more harm than good. And we saw, like in Lewiston, Maine, for example, where there were mental health services available, but some of the victims were saying that they weren't trauma trained. And so it wasn't helpful. And as Chief Mullen said, we don't want to be doing more harm than good when we're responding to these events, so that if we're not connected with all of those services and understand what are the roles that people play, what can they bring to the table here, then we're not helping the people who need us most at that time.
And I think the last thing I'll say about that before we move on is that if you don't have the victim services providers at the table where you're doing your preparation, your planning, it's very difficult for you to understand and identify the gaps that you have in that area. If they're sitting at the table with you as you're going through the process of planning and preparation, they can give you some really good information about what you need in your plan that might not be there, how you can expand that plan, and also provide you with some training that your officers and your leadership could utilize very effectively during the response process.
I think you've both just reiterated that timing is obviously not logistical alone, it's strategic. And this early involvement shapes everything that follows. And so I think that that's really important for people to take away and remember. And just as we kind of laid the foundation, I think that was a pretty powerful look at why victim services have to be part of the conversation at the very beginning. But now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about how these efforts intersect with law enforcement and public safety. And so I'll start with you, Chief Mullen, and you've obviously lived this firsthand from the perspective of a leader in a community of the police department. How did you approach integrating victim services following the 2015 shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church?
Yeah, well, I have to start at before the incident, because I think that's really where I want leaders in public safety to be thinking in terms of creating the relationships and the connections ahead of the incident is critical, because clearly what we were able to do in the immediate aftermath of the incident, as well as long-term recovery, was built on years of relationship building ahead of that incident. We were creating opportunities through regional victim advocate training and associations, getting to know one another. We were able to bring in mental health, embed them into our department ahead of this incident. We were able to create connections with at that time, the National Crime Center around homicide survivors and sexual assault survivors. So we were doing trauma-informed training. So we were doing a lot of things ahead of time that really created the opportunity for us when we had this incident to bring together and surge victim services resources into our FRC within hours, very short period of time after that incident occurred. And because of those relationships, we were able to assign and identify points of contact for each one of our family members, the victims and survivors. We were also able to really identify, grant opportunities. We were able to work together, bringing together victim advocates from around the area, both at the police department level, as well as our prosecutor and federal prosecutor offices, to work together. So as we went through the prosecution stages, there were very seamless handoffs. We were still working closely together. So all of those things are critically important, but I think the most important thing that I would say for any leader that's listening to this is the fact that you have to create those trusting relationships ahead of the incident. You can use these daily activities you have, the crimes that you respond to, the different incidents that occur within your communities. You can use those to strengthen and build those relationships so that when that person walks into your FRC in the most critical moment, you know who they are and you trust that they're going to do the right thing, that they're going to be believing in the same values and the same set of objectives and strategies that you want to accomplish in terms of providing the greatest amount of support for those family members and for those communities. And the other thing I think is really important that we were able to do outside of the direct victim services for the victims and the survivors and the families of those that were directly impacted. This incident really impacted our community broadly. The fear and the mental health issues that occurred across the community were really significant. And we had to figure out how we were going to deal with that mass community need. So we were able, again, to reach out to a partner that we have been working with for years in other community activities that had a really great crisis communication hotline set up. They were able to connect people to resources immediately. We were able to bring them into our command post and work with them long-term to provide not only for our immediate victims and the survivors, but also the broader community, which is really going to be impacted significantly in these types of incidents.
I think that kind of leadership and acknowledging both the operational and obviously the emotional realities is crucial. I mean, as you've just highlighted. Elizabeth, from NMVC's standpoint, How do you think that law enforcement agencies can better understand the value that victim services bring to long-term recovery, kind of building on what Chief Mullen just spoke about?
Well, it's refreshing to hear someone like Chief Mullen talk about how they went about working with the victim services community, because that's not universal among agencies across the country. And, what it shows you is that their response to the Mother Emanuel tragedy was so much better because of those relationships. And I think I spent 14 years as a prosecutor, so I have that law enforcement connection. And, we used to do a lot of training with law enforcement so that they understood, victim services, that they understood, what organizations were in the community that could be of assistance to them. The way I always think about it is you're selling something essentially to say, how can we work together to make your job easier and make my job easier? And the way to do that is to understand the dynamics of everything that they have to do and what we have to do. And, when I was at the New York State OVS, we got ourselves invited to participate in the EOC at the state level and worked very closely with, for example, like the New York State Police. We need to get all these different agencies to understand not only what we all do, but how our work benefits them and also benefits the victims. And if you have a case where the perpetrator is taken alive and there may be a trial, you want your victims to be able to be available to you to aid in the prosecution of the case. And if you don't have victims who feel that there's trust, that they've been supported, and that they have the resources that they need, you're not going to have a successful prosecution. And in cases like these, you don't want to find yourself in that position. So it's really being open and willing and understanding that everyone has their roles, but that we all intersect, especially in cases like this. And that if you want to reduce the amount of chaos that inevitably is going to arise with a mass violence incident, that we need to be partners, that we're not adversaries. It's not like one thing is a soft type of field and the other is a hard type of field. We are stronger together, and we will make, as Chief Mullen said, the whole community suffers from this. This isn't just individuals. And if the National Mass Violence Center is located at the Medical University of South Carolina, which is a research institution, and most of the folks that work for NMVC are clinical psychologists and have done a lot of research that these incidents have long-term impact for everybody. And so we need to have a collaboration so that we know what we need to do collectively to heal the community.
So summing up from what you both just said, at least from what I took away from it, is that collaboration is obviously key. And then when it's done well, it creates this strong foundation for the road ahead, right? As you kind of mentioned, the long-term piece of it. And we know that recovery doesn't end when that immediate crisis response winds down, which we kind of touched upon earlier. So now I'd like to turn to what it takes to build these plans that lasts, right? Months, even years after an incident. One of the challenges is sustaining the support over months, even years later. So what does a successful infrastructure look like to support victims and their evolving needs over time?
Well, I think clearly what has to occur in these situations in terms of an infrastructure, long-term recovery infrastructure, is that you have to have the appropriate support of the community that has been impacted by this incident, because this is going to be a long-term effort, and it's going to take funding, it's going to take staffing, it's going to require programming, and all of those things have to be put in place so that there is consistency and there is trust. Again, you're going to hear me say trust a lot, because I believe that is the foundation. whether it's with other law enforcement agencies that are coming in to assist you, whether it's victim services, whether it's the victim and survivors, whether it's the community. If you lose the trust of any of those individuals based on your either inappropriate response or your failure to prepare to respond or your actual tactical and operational response, then that's going to create problems for you moving through this process. So all of the things that you put into place, they have to be consistent, they have to be dependable, and they have to be, as we've talked about before, they have to be trauma informed, the people that are operating these facilities, because you're going to move from your FRC into a resiliency center, hopefully. That's what your goal is. And you can utilize that through the resources that the Mass Violence Center can help with. There's obviously federal funding programs that allow you to get money that will help you to carry those out for a period of time. So that infrastructure is very important. Again, to put that into place, you can't wait till the event occurs, because what's going to happen there is it's going to cause delays. It's going to cause you not to be able to provide the resources that are so desperately needed to those individuals that have been impacted. Because once you get the funding and the staffing, the programming, the support, then that's what you're going to have to go through this long-term recovery that, like we talked about. I mean, in some cities that have had these incidents, the resiliency centers have been up for years, and they are still providing services to people. I mean, I know in some communities, they are still returning articles, and during that period of time, that really can impact individuals' mental and behavioral health. So these things have to be in place, and it's not a hit or miss. People have to be able to depend on it, and that's why it's so important that all of these things that we're talking about today has support from the highest levels of the community, possibly even state government, because it's not going to be something that's going to happen in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. It's going to go away. These things are going to have to be in place for long term, so that they can provide not only effective mental and behavioral health and support to those survivors and victims of today. But Elizabeth can talk to this much better than I can, but there are some people that are involved in these incidents that do not have needs for services for years after the actual incident. And we still have to be there to provide that to them.
I have a couple of examples. I think that sustainability is the crux of this. That it's very easy, and I've been on a million committees where I get assigned to a work group or something, and everybody goes in and we're all excited and we're all motivated, and then it just sort of peters out and nothing happens. You cannot do this with mass violence preparation. And, like in any professions, chiefs of police leave, they retire, there's changes in leadership in all kinds of organizations. And so you can't allow the program or the planning process and the working groups to sort of just go away because there's been a change in leadership. So there has to be a structure that would allow that to continue with their work and to build on it and not sort of, put it on a shelf so it collects dust. You want to make sure that people are assigned to it, that they're redoing their, partner lists and phone numbers and all of that. And I think it was last week, it was announced that 3 more victims were identified from 9/11. 9/11 was 24 years ago. So 3 more people were identified. Now, what happens with the families and the friends of those victims is that they get reactivated, by this. And so, as Chief Mullen was saying, that there isn't a timeline for healing with this, and things are going to happen, whether it's another mass violence incident someplace else that activates people's response. I've seen that happen many times where something happens for example, in Buffalo, that was a terrible tragedy for that community. 10 days later was Uvalde. And so everybody that was working in Buffalo are still so traumatized, and now they're reading about this other incident. And, Boulder, Colorado has had 2 mass violence incidents there, most recently just a few weeks ago. And so if they aren't continually thinking this through and planning and staying on top of it, they're just going to be back to square one, where, it's not going to be helpful to the victims of the latest tragedy.
So going back to that idea of the partnerships, it really sounds like that network or that kind of collaborative web is really what holds things together when something else unexpected might happen or funding shifts, any of these types of things where circumstances change. And we just talked about obviously sustaining recovery being one challenge, but we also talked about earlier or mentioned that the whole community is affected by a mass violence event. So how do we make sure that recovery efforts reach all individuals and communities affected? And how can we kind of ensure that those efforts are grounded in compassion and an understanding of trauma from the very beginning?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention, it's a little off topic, but I'll lead into it. In my former role, we funded victim advocates in many police jurisdictions and district attorney's offices. So we had them, and probation officers. So we had victim advocates in the New York State Police, in multiple police jurisdictions, in sheriff's offices, in many district attorney's offices. So those folks are there and can work with their law enforcement organizations to make sure that that they know what's going on in the field and that they have people who are able to deploy and respond. The major thing about planning is to include all the people that need to be there. And we created a list of partner stakeholders that is pages long. And it was meant to be inclusive because all response is local. And so we don't know individually across 50 states, what are the needs and the resources of every single community that might be impacted by mass violence, but you do. And so here's a list of all the organizations and the people that might be helpful in a response. And then you make a determination as to which of those agencies are appropriate, for your planning and response. And it runs the gamut from, we were working with the Department of Interior because they have a lot of tourists and foreign nationals who come. And so their response is going to look very different from somebody who's in a tiny rural community someplace else. And I think what's most important is, and I think Greg had raised this about gaps, is you have to understand what your community has and what it doesn't have. And they need to appreciate that when a mass violence incident happens, you are instantly going to be overwhelmed. Your resources are going to be taxed and you are going to be overwhelmed. So what we found in Buffalo is that all the people that were responding knew people in this neighborhood, knew people who were impacted directly by this. And they were probably not the appropriate people to be doing this response because they were all traumatized. And so it's understanding what is available to you outside of your immediate circle that you can bring in. Who are the partners that are maybe outside of who you would normally call on in order to make sure that you are covered, if something, because we don't know if a mass violence incident happens, we don't know how big it's going to be or what population is going to be impacted or what your needs are going to be. So understanding what your resources are, having all those folks at the table as well. If you have victim services at the table, if you have state victim comp, you have victim assistance programs, they know who's available in their field, and can look at a broader spectrum of available programs than somebody else can. So, making sure you have law enforcement and fire and Red Cross and emergency managers and hospitals and schools and victim assistance and behavioral mental health, like all of those people need to be involved in the conversation. District attorneys, federal prosecutors, if it could be a federal crime, so that everybody is operating off the same playbook.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, especially for police leaders, to look at, we all have meetings that we go to in our regions for police chiefs and fire chiefs and emergency managers, and obviously that gives us an opportunity to collaborate. And I found it to be very impactful. And when we started to use that same type of philosophy for our victim advocates that worked in the region, bringing them together regularly to talk about what they were doing in their communities, what they were seeing in their communities, the struggles and the challenges that they were having in terms of daily activities responding to victims, whether that be marginalized communities or communities that were evolving within our community. They obviously had a better understanding of what they were seeing from the victim services perspective. Then utilizing resources that are available to us today, like the Mass Violence Center. I mean, obviously they are willing to come in and provide resources to you as an organization or as a region, a county, to provide you with information about what might be available to help. And by bringing all of those things together, what's happening is that you are creating this awareness. And again, you're filling gaps. And I think that's an important lesson for law enforcement or public safety leaders, is because we often get so focused on the operational or the tactical response that we don't think about the victim services aspects, because we have people in our agencies that's their full-time job and that's what they do. And when we're having exercises or when we're having tabletops or we're having planning sessions, very rarely do they sit in the room with us and share their knowledge and share their information about what we should be thinking about. And what happens even less is that when we have exercises, I would dare say that the vast majority of law enforcement or public safety exercises around the country that are involved responses to or mass violence, especially with public safety, is that we get to the end of the tactical response or the rescue task force response, or maybe moving some patients, and that's where we end it. We never move to the point of activating our FRC and getting our people in place for those victim services, and understanding that FRC and victim services component has to be activated within a couple of hours and run parallel with our police investigation or crime scene response. All of those things that we do and do very well, this new victim services component is just as important. And in many, many cases, we have seen that if we don't do that well, not only are we going to lose the trust of our communities, we're also going to be criticized in terms of how we responded, regardless of how we operated from a tactical or an operational response. So victim services has to be at the table with us very early. They have to be part of our incident command system. We have to become comfortable with that, and we have to be willing to listen to them regarding their expertise, because there's so many things that run the gamut, not only from direct engagement with victims and survivors, as well as first responders. They also can help us in terms of the communications that we use in press releases or talking with individual victims and survivors, because clearly there are things that we can say that could be more traumatizing or create more issues with that particular response. And we want to be mindful of that. Obviously, they're not going to get involved in our operational decision making, but certainly be there as an advisor for us. And then as we move into that long-term recovery, then we're going to be supporting them based on their expertise and based on the needs that they have. So all of those things are critical. And I think it goes back again to looking at who you can partner with, who you can trust, who you can collaborate with, who has a common purpose, which is strengthening our community, so that when we have a situation like this, we can respond with a level of excellence that we all want. And that's how we make sure that the victim services gives us what we need, so that we are inclusive in all of our responses.
The other thing is that for public safety purposes, which, is obviously the major focus for law enforcement, is if you have a community that is completely traumatized and is not feeling supported and does not feel like they have trust in the system, it could lead to adverse outcomes for the community in the long run that would impact law enforcement. So, there's a whole host of reasons why it's important that we do it right.
I think the guidance you've both just shared really offers a great foundation, especially for jurisdictions wondering where to even start. But I know that there's a lot for any of our listeners here today to think about. I just have a few more questions to kind of close out. I wanted to ask, what do you think, and we may have already touched on this a little bit, but what's the most maybe significant mindset or operational shift that agencies have to make if they want to integrate victim services effectively? I know we keep going back to trust being a big piece of this, but is there one thing you can boil it down to, even that shift that might be a blind spot for some people?
Collaboration is the most important, and coordination, to understanding that everybody has an important role to play in this, and that it isn't, that each person's role shouldn't be mutually exclusive to everything else, that if we're looking to heal this community, it has to be a coordinated response, and that there needs to be not only trust, but respect for the role that every single organization and institution plays. And that it's not, I think as Chief Mullen said, that each organization is not saying, I'm going to run your organization or you need to do it my way. It's more, how can we do this together? How do we not get in your way? So when you're responding and making the community safe, from a mass violence incident, we're not going to get in your way. But how can we work with you to make sure that, like he said, when you're going to open the Friends and Relatives Center within 0 to 24 hours, that we're doing that together, and that we're going to make it as comprehensive and useful and effective as possible to reduce trauma.
Yeah, and I'd say probably the two key things for me that public safety and law enforcement specifically has to come to grips with is the fact that we need to integrate victim services as a significant and equal component in our response plans, and not as a secondary consideration, because that is, I think, in a lot of cases, that has not been that's not been the standard operating procedure that we had them in our plans, in terms of being part of the incident command system, being in our command post with us, and actually providing advice and operational necessity within that structure. And then the second thing is, it kind of goes along with that, is that we've got to be willing to accept non-public safety personnel into our leadership structure, or into our incident command structure, so that they can engage and provide us that information, so that we can activate these really important components in parallel with one another, and not feel like that, okay, we can get to that at some point. That's not where we are today. People expect for these family and relative centers to be activated almost immediately. And from what the research will tell you, is that within a couple of hours is a benchmark. And if you're much past that, then you're going to be behind. So you want to make sure that you've got everything in place. And the way that you do that is you collaborate, as Elizabeth said. You bring these people in early on. You work with them. You begin to build that collaboration. And you all are going towards that common purpose, which is you want to serve your community in its worst possible moment with excellence. And you want to be able to provide them with the resources, with the empathy, and with the humanity that we all would want our family or our friends who are in a similar situation to receive from their law enforcement and public safety professionals that are in that city, to provide safety and security for everyone.
As you've both stated so eloquently, I think it's not just what these agencies do, right? The personnel in these agencies, about how they think about recovery and who they see as essential to that process. And so thank you. I think that those are some very practical, thoughtful starting points for agencies that want to do better. And in the case of any of these types of events, really serve their communities in the way that you could idealize, right? The best possible response. And so to close out, I'd love to thank you both for your time, your expertise, and ongoing leadership in this space, and the work that you are both doing to kind of center this around victims and support long-term recovery makes a difference. And I can speak on behalf of the team at IACP. We're very grateful to be in this effort with you. I think this conversation is a really powerful reminder that embedding victim services into recovery is not just a best practice, it's essential. And we can't wait until after a crisis has passed to start thinking about these things. And I guess I'd leave it with, unless you have anything to add, that just if people would like to learn more about the National Mass Violence Center or connect with resources and guidance, visit nmvvrc.org, and that'll be in the show notes. And then to explore the IACP's Mass Violence Advisory Initiative, visit theiacp.org/projects/Mass Violence Advisory Initiative. Anything that you'd like to kind of add to that before we close out for this episode?
I would like to just thank you and, reiterate that, or emphasize, I should say, that it's because of partnerships like the one we have with IACP, and because of the deep bench of consultants we have, like Chief Mullen, we are really able to be there for communities both before, during, and after. And, we hope that communities will utilize our planning division, but we also have a very robust response division that can work with communities after an event happens and for the long term. And I'm so glad that you gave the website information, because we have, we are replete with information and guidance, and we have all kinds of tip sheets and videos and all sorts of stuff that will be helpful to anyone who's looking for some assistance. You just reach out to us either for planning information or for a response, and we are here for you.
Yeah, and I just thank you and IACP for illuminating this particular topic, because it is so very important, and it has such impact on our communities as they deal with mass violence incidents. So thank you, and thank IACP for their leadership.
Excellent. I appreciate both of your time, and I think that wraps up this episode of our special podcast series. I'd like to thank everyone out there for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.